You are holy, bridge. Oh, all blessing and honor, glory and power forever and ever. All blessing and honor, glory and power unto your name unending. All blessing and honor, glory and power forever and ever. All blessing and honor, glory and power unto your name unending. Glory to God in the highest. That's pretty much the whole song. So the set list now is No One, Praise, What a God, and Only You Are Holy. That's our set list. No, maybe. Actually, I just swiped it off, so. No One, Praise, What a God, Only You Are Holy. We did that with 5 minutes of practice.
Test 1, 2. Can you guys hear me out there? I turned it. Yep, it should be on. Test 1, 2. Test, test, test. 1, 2. You got me now? Okay. All right. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Let us pray. Father, in the mighty name of Yeshua, we just thank you for today. We thank you for your goodness, your kindness, your love, and your mercy. We just thank you and ask, Father, in Yeshua's name, that you would open our eyes to behold wondrous things from your Torah. In Yeshua's name, amen. Amen. All right. The last time I was here, I taught on Hebrews 8:13. And what I did not tell you guys was that it was a two-part teaching. And and I was supposed to mention that, so it's kind of funny. So I get home and I get an email from, I can't remember who it was, but it's someone in the congregation. And I got an email and they said, well, Tony, I'm kind of surprised that you Hebrews 8:13 is about the priesthood and the covenant, and you didn't say anything about that, and I'm a little disappointed, basically. and then I emailed back and I said, you know what? That's pretty good. I like that because they were right. But I had forgotten to mention that it's a two-part teaching, and that I'd be back to do the second part later. So here I am. Here to do the second part. So let me give you a quick kind of introduction to kind of recover what we found out so far. So our verse is Hebrews 8:13, where it talks about something growing old and becoming obsolete and vanishing away. And so that whole discussion starts in Hebrews 8:7 through 13. And so the main point that I made last time is that there are two spheres of obsolescence. I call them spheres of obsolescence. In other words, there's two main areas where something's going to grow obsolete and vanish. And so sphere one, I covered last time I was here, and those are actions taken by Adonai to ensure that Israel fulfills her Mosaic covenantal responsibilities. Okay, and that's captured for us in Hebrews 8:10 through 11. And let's read the yellow part. It says, I will put my laws in their mind and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. None of them shall teach his neighbor, and none his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. And as you can see there, that is the new covenant. That's part of the new covenant. And so this is an action that Adonai has taken to ensure that Israel fulfills the Mosaic covenant. Okay, it's not something different, but it's what he's doing. And so the second sphere is Hebrews 8:12. So you have Hebrews 8, 10, and 11, and then 12. And the second sphere has to do with actions that Adonai is going to take towards forgiveness, where he says, their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Okay, so those are the two areas that our homilist is giving to us right there at the beginning of Hebrews, towards the beginning of Hebrews 8. And so it's my assertion that the proper understanding of Hebrews 8:13, it depends on understanding these two spheres of obsolescence, or things that are going to grow old. Okay? So now, amazingly, in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 16 to 17, it repeats those two same spheres of obsolescence. So in Hebrews 10, 16 to 17, notice it says, this is the covenant I will make with them after those days. He says, I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds I will write them. Well, see, that was from Hebrews 8, 10, and 11. And then he says, in verse 17, look at this, their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Well, that was from Hebrews 8:12. It's actually verbatim. And when you look at it, Hebrews 10:16 is a shortened summary of Hebrews 8:10 through 11. So you can see right there, there's Hebrews 8:10 through 11. Notice how it starts. This is the covenant I will make. And notice how Hebrews 10:16 starts. This is the covenant that I will make. You see? So he's repeating it. And then everything in the yellow where it says, I will put my laws in their mind, write them on their hearts, I will be their God, etc., that's all shortened in Hebrews 10:16 to say, I will put my laws in their hearts, and in their minds I will write them. You see that? Right? So everything in Hebrews 10 through 11 talks about, I'll put my laws in their mind, I'll write them on the hearts, I'll be their God, they shall be my people, no one will have to teach anyone. He summarizes all of that from Hebrews 8:10 through 11 in Hebrews 10:16 by simply saying, picking the major part of that, which is, I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds I will write them. So he has clearly repeated at the end here what he started off with in the beginning, okay? And so, I want to make sure, okay, I see what I'm doing here. All right, operator error. All right, because I'm a little ahead of the slide, so let me get caught up here. So there you go, right there, okay? All right, so right there, this is the covenant I will make at the top. This is the covenant I will make at the bottom. And then I will put my laws into their hearts and into their minds and write them. And then when you go down to Hebrews 10:16, you can see actually the same thing. And so what we're seeing here is that Hebrews 10:16 through 17 is repeating what he said at the beginning. Okay, and then Hebrews 12 is Hebrews 8:12, where it says, for their sins and lawless deeds I will remember no more. That's repeated in Hebrews 10:17. Okay, and so what I want to suggest to you is that, in summary, our author, he is focusing in on two what I call spheres of obsolescence. The first one I dealt with when I was here last time, and that first sphere of what's becoming and growing obsolete is the original covenant. But let me explain how. It's modifications to the original covenant agreement as stated in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Now, if you look at the screen there, on the left, I've got Deuteronomy 6:4-9, and on the right, I have the new covenant. And this is how you're going to see how the Mosaic covenant has changed, right? The Mosaic covenant, there is a certain aspect of the Mosaic covenant that is obsolete, but look at what it is, all right? So if you look at Deuteronomy 6:4-9 and Hebrews 8:10-12, you will see the color coding there in the green, the yellow, and the red. So in Deuteronomy 6:4-9, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul and your strength. Well, in the new covenant, that's basically repeated in the green. He says, I will be their God and they shall be my people. And then he says in the green further down in verse 12, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness and their sins. In other words, he is going to initiate the love relationship. He's saying, hey, I'm going to be their God. They're going to be my people. That's the love relationship. The difference is that in Deuteronomy 6:4-9, Israel was commanded to love him. But in the new covenant, he's saying, I'm going to love Israel, okay? So it's not that the Mosaic law is done away with as far as there needs to be that love relationship. The difference is in who's responsible for making it happen, you see. The same thing here in the yellow. It says, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And then in verse 8, it says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house. Everything in the yellow is about Israel's responsibility to get Adonai's Torah within their hearts. But it's their responsibility, okay? That aspect of the Mosaic law is still in force. What's obsolete is that it's their responsibility, because now in the new covenant, he says, I will put my laws in their mind and write them in their lives. You see the difference there? You see the difference? In Deuteronomy 6:4-9, he commands them. He says, these words which I command you, they should be in your heart. You need to write them on your doorpost, your heart, everything. But in the new covenant, this is the big difference. In the new covenant, Adonai says, I'm going to do it. Okay? He says, I'm going to do it. And then lastly, it says, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Again, in the original Mosaic covenant, it was Israel's responsibility to disciple each other and to disciple their children. Well, in the new covenant, they still need to be discipled. The difference is that in the new covenant, Adonai says none of them shall teach his neighbor. See, before he said you need to teach your children. As you walk along the way, you need to do this. But he says in the new covenant, hey, you know what? None of them are going to teach their neighbor and their brother saying, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, says the Lord. In other words, he's going to make sure. He's going to do it. He's going to do something in Israel in such a way that he's going to ensure that all of these Mosaic covenantal law responsibilities for Israel are fulfilled in Israel, because he's going to make it happen. And he says, I'm going to do it. And as I said before, when Adonai says that he's going to do it, it's going to happen. Because the whole point with the Mosaic law is that the people didn't do those three things. And so the best way to see the difference between the Mosaic law and the new covenant is taking Deuteronomy 6:4-9 and comparing it to Jeremiah 31. This is Jeremiah 31:31-34. And Jeremiah obviously had Deuteronomy 6:4-9 in mind when he wrote the new covenant, because as you can see, all the color coding, it's the same thing that was in the Moses law, that was in the law of Moses. The only difference is who's responsible for making it happen. So the obsolescence, what's growing old and ready to disappear, is not the Mosaic law that, hey, you all have to know the Lord and you all have to have his laws written within you, etc., and loving the Lord. What's changed is that Adonai said, you know what, you couldn't do it, but I can do it. So instead of you being responsible, I'm going to take responsibility for making sure that it happened, and it's going to happen. you see. So it's not like the law is done away. It's all a matter of responsibility. So the difference between the new covenant and the Mosaic covenant, instead of relying upon Israel to love Adonai, internalize his words within their hearts so that those words could be lived out and disciple each other, Adonai himself is going to establish a relationship of love with them. He's going to write the law of Moses on the people's hearts, and he's going to ensure that everyone is discipled and knows him. So you see, it's not like the Mosaic law is done away with. It's not done away with. All those things that Adonai commanded Israel in Deuteronomy 6:4-9 still have to occur. The only difference is who's responsible for making them happen. And the way we're able to see that clearly is by comparing and contrasting Deuteronomy 6:4-9 with Jeremiah 31. So in summary, our author is focusing on Adonai. So that's what we covered last time. So let's talk about what we're here today. Today we're here to talk about the second sphere of obsolescence. And these are modifications to how Israel will secure forgiveness. Okay, so how is Israel going to secure forgiveness? Because remember, I told you the second sphere of obsolescence has to do with how he said he's going to forgive them and remember their sins no more. So, since the Torah teaches us that forgiveness of sin is only obtained through the sacrifice of an innocent substitute, this second sphere of obsolescence naturally leads us to a discussion of the Aaronic priesthood and the sacrificial system, right? Because Adonai, he's invested a lot of ink in Leviticus in telling us how people secure forgiveness with him. You get forgiveness from him through the blood of an innocent substitute. And so, since we're talking about forgiveness, that obviously means we need to look at the Levitical priesthood and the animal sacrifices. So first of all, let's figure this out. The basis for forgiveness of Israel's sins is not found in the institutions of the Mosaic law. Okay? And some of you may be thinking, think about that again. The basis for forgiveness of Israel's sin is not based, not that it's not found. I should tell you, it's not that it's not found. It is found there. The basis is not in those institutions themselves. Okay? The author of Hebrews makes it clear that the basis for Israel's forgiveness is not found in the institutions of the Mosaic law. No, it's not based on them. Listen to what he says here. For on the one hand, there is the annulling of the former commandment because of its weaknesses and unprofitableness. Now notice what he says here. He says, for the law made nothing perfect. Now you can read that in a couple of different ways, right? And we know how most New Covenant believers read that. They look at it like this. Man, the law made nothing perfect. The law messed up everything, right? That's the way most people take that. Man, the law made everything. Every time something, the law touched anything, it was a disaster. Well, that's not what he's saying. He's saying it in this sense. He's saying the law didn't bring perfection. It wasn't that it was something negative. The law was never meant to bring perfection. He's just telling us a fact here. He's saying, hey guys, the law didn't make everything perfect. He's not saying it in a negative way, like, that law, that mean, onerous law, didn't bring, it was imperfect itself and it didn't bring perfection. No, he's just telling us a fact. He's just wanting everyone to know, hey, the law didn't and doesn't bring perfection, and it wasn't supposed to, right? So that's the first thing. He's just trying to get that across to us, okay? All right, again, the way into the holiest of all was not yet manifested while the first tabernacle was standing. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service, look at this word again, perfect in regard to conscience. Again, the writer of Hebrews, he is constantly using that word perfect. And he's telling us over and over again how things associated with the Mosaic law, specifically the Aaronic priesthood, animal sacrifices, and that earthly tabernacle, they didn't bring perfection. They couldn't bring total perfection as far as forgiveness of sin is concerned. So there it is again. So in other words, all I'm saying is that he's trying to tell us that the law is not the vehicle for bringing perfection. And we'll talk about perfection in a second. Here it is in Hebrews 10, 1 through 4 again. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, can never make those who approach perfect. There it is again. You see? So he's laboring this. He's saying it over and over. The law cannot make those who approach perfect. But it was never meant to. It was never meant to. He's saying, hey, it can't make those perfect. Hebrews 10, 11. And every priest stand ministering daily, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. Whoa. Remember I told you? What did I say this is all about here? How the basis of Israel's forgiveness was not the basis, or the basis is not in the priesthood and the animal sacrifices. This states it very clearly. He says, and every priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never. He's like those sacrifices can't take away sins. Now some of you are probably thinking, well, what do they do it for? Well, why do we have to go through all of this? Okay. Adonai was teaching them about sin and redemption and forgiveness. And as long as they approached in faith and offered that animal in faith, what he promised is that he would forgive them. If you go back and you look in Leviticus, he's promising them over and over, right? If you do this, I will forgive you. But when you go through Leviticus, he never says that those sacrifices wiped away sin. He never says that those sacrifices were the basis for the total expiation of sin that is totally done away with. What he said every time, you can go look at it, he just said, he will be forgiven. He will be forgiven. He will be forgiven. So in summary, the basis for Israel's forgiveness is not found in institutions of the law. And the writer of Hebrews is making that clear. He's like, the law doesn't bring perfection. Okay, it doesn't bring perfection. All right, so now that we know, so this isn't anything negative about the law, right? Everything has its time, place, and purpose. And it was not the time, place, and purpose for the Mosaic law to bring perfection. So this should naturally ask us, we should naturally say, well, why were the institutions of the Mosaic law ineffective at securing Israel's forgiveness? Because he just told you, he says other place, he says the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sins, right? Everybody with me? Did he not say that? Right? He's like, the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. But obviously there is some basis, so let's figure it out. Why were the institutions of the Mosaic law ineffective? Okay, here's the reason why. The institutions, again, could not bring perfection. Now, notice this again. He says, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should be found according to the order of Melchizedek? In other words, again, he's saying, hey, you know, the priesthood, lost my place. Right, the Levitical priesthood, he's like, if the Levitical priesthood could bring perfection, he's basically saying we wouldn't need the Melchizedekian priesthood. There wouldn't be any need to find another priesthood. If the Levitical priesthood worked, we wouldn't need another priesthood. So that's what he's saying right there, okay? Listen to this. He says, for the law made nothing perfect. There it is again, okay? How about this? Now that we know that the institutions of the law cannot bring perfection, right? He just said they can't bring perfection. What should we ask next? What does our homilist mean when he uses the word perfection? Okay, what does he mean when he says perfection? And I believe for our homilist, perfection is the state where there is no more need for sacrifice of sin. Therefore, perfection is when Adonai's people don't sin anymore and there is no more need for sacrifices. Okay, that's what perfection is. When our homilist is talking about perfection, he's talking about Revelation 21, right? There's no more sin. No one's going to sin anymore. And there will be no need for sacrifices anymore. Once we get to eternity, that's it. The former things have passed away. Behold, all has become new. There will be no more crying for, there will be no more of this present earth of people sinning and needing forgiveness, okay? And so that's what he's talking about when he mentions perfection. The institutions of the Mosaic Law could not bring this. And how do we know this? Because of what we're headed towards. Revelation 21, 1 through 22:5 is Adonai's ultimate goal for humanity, total redemption of man and this world, where sin will not exist anymore. Adonai is going to have a perfect world. Once eternity starts, it will be perfect, and there will be no more sin and no more sacrifices for sin. And what he's saying is that the law couldn't do that. All right, so let's look at the animal sacrifices and the priesthood to determine why they couldn't bring perfection. All right, so here's the first thing: why the Aaronic priesthood could not bring perfection. Because he tells us. He says in Hebrews 7:11, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should arise according to the order of Melchizedek? So right here, we learn that first of all, we learn that the Aaronic priesthood couldn't bring perfection. But secondly, what we learn is that the Melchizedekian priesthood can bring perfection. That's what we learn by this right here. Because he said, hey, if the Levitical priest could bring perfection, why do we need the Melchizedek priesthood? We need the Melchizedek priesthood because the Aaronic priesthood couldn't bring perfection, and the Melchizedek priesthood can. Okay? All right? So we're looking at why the Aaronic priesthood couldn't bring perfection. Hebrews 7:16. Who has come not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. And here we learn the basis for the qualification for the Aaronic priesthood was merely being a blood relative of Aaron, right? In other words, to be a high priest, basically the stipulation was that you had to be from the lineage of Aaron. You had to be one of Aaron's descendants. And so what he's saying here is this qualification of being a blood relative of Aaron, that was for the Levitical priesthood, whereas the qualification for the Melchizedekian priesthood is the power of an endless life. Okay? The power of an endless life. Therefore, perfection can only be mediated by someone with an endless life. You see that? In other words, in the courts of heaven, he has already decreed that in order for perfection, for there to be a total doing away with sin and a perfecting of God's people, the priest has to have an endless life. He can't be someone who dies. And that's what we learn here. Therefore, perfection can only be mediated by someone with an endless life. Okay? Hebrews 7:23 through 25. Let's listen to that. Let's read this, see what we can get out of this. He says, there were many priests because they were prevented from death by continuing. So see, this is something negative about the Aaronic priesthood. He's like, Houston, we got a problem. These priests keep dying, right? And so what he's saying here is that the priests, they could not complete and fulfill their duty because they had to die. It says, but he, Yeshua, because he lives forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he ever lives to make intercession for them. And yes, amen. In other words, here we learn that only a priest who lives forever can save people. Only a priest who has an endless life can save people. That's why the Aaronic priesthood was not the basis for Israel's sin. Because he can make intercession for the people he represents forever. And the Aaronic priesthood couldn't do that. Yeshua's blood that he shed It is going to cover us for all eternity. It's not something that's like, okay, well, it happened and now we're good and now we can figure it out. No, 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 no. As we live with Adonai throughout eternity, Revelation 21, it's the blood of the Lamb that holds that all together. It's the blood of the Lamb that's going to ensure that Adonai's people don't sin anymore. It's going to be the blood of the Lamb that ensures forgiveness forever. But here we learn that only a priest who has an endless life, like Yeshua, is going to work. Okay? Let's look at another one. Hebrews 7:26-27. For such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, and separate from sinners. Now, here's the big one right here. Here we learn that, now this is all about bringing in perfection, mind you, right? Let's not forget that. Let's not forget that. These are all the reasons why the Aaronic priesthood could not bring perfection, which is everything. It's bringing us to Revelation 21, where there is no more sin. No one's sinning and no one needs forgiveness, where it's over. And notice, so here we learn that perfection can only be brought by a priest who is himself sinless. And that's the other reason. So we're just going through what our homilist is saying here, and we're just saying, okay, what are the reasons why the Aaronic priesthood could not bring perfection? And that's what we're doing. And we're just going through and we're just picking them out one by one. And right here, he clearly says that, he clearly intimates here that perfection can only be brought by a priest who is himself sinless, right? Because Yeshua was wholly sinless and undefiled. Hebrews 7:28. For the law appoints as high priests those who have weakness, but the word of truth which came after the law appoints the Son who has been perfected forever. Now notice that last phrase there, the Son who has been perfected forever. So here we learn that perfection can only come from a priest who himself has been perfected. You see that? Only can come from a priest. So in other words, it's a high standard. It's a high standard that a priest has to meet in order to bring perfection through sacrifice. And Yeshua is the only one who could do it, you see. See, the Aaronic priesthood, they're striking out left and right. Now, they were good for the time. They were good for teaching us all of this so that we can understand what perfection is all about. But here, he says he appoints the Son who's been perfected forever. Yeshua was perfected. Hebrews is very clear that he had to suffer and be perfected. It says, though he were a son, right? Though he were a son, yet he still had to be perfected in his humanity. It wasn't that Yeshua was imperfect, right? But he still had to be perfected through suffering. And the Bible the Bible makes that clear. And so he has been perfected. The Aaronic priesthoods, the Aaronic priests, they had not been perfected. So in summary, we have seen that the reasons why the Aaronic priesthood could not bring perfection, and two, the reasons why perfection can only be brought in by a priest of the order of Melchizedek, which is what Yeshua is. So see, Yeshua is a different type of priest. He's not an Aaronic priest. He wasn't descended from Aaron, right? He's a different type of priest that's introduced to us very clearly in Psalm 110. So he's a different type of priest, okay? All right, so we've looked at why the priests couldn't bring perfection. High standard, right? Got to have an endless life. If you don't have an endless life, you can't bring perfection. But Yeshua did. Now we want to look at why the Levitical sacrifices could not bring perfection, okay? So here's the other aspect, okay? Because again, remember, what we're trying to do is let's bring it back to what we're trying to do. There's a certain sphere of obsolescence. Something is about to vanish. Something is about to grow old, and something is about to be obsolete. And we know it has something to do with the priesthood, animal sacrifices, and the earthly tabernacle, because those are the institutions that Adonai instituted for forgiveness. And in the new covenant, he says, I'm going to forgive them and remember their sins no more. So how's that going to happen? And that's a problem if the Aaronic priesthood couldn't do it, and if the animal sacrifices couldn't do it. That's a potential problem. And so he's given us the solution here. All right, so what about the Levitical sacrifices? Hebrews 9:23. Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of things in heaven should be purified with these, but heavenly things with better sacrifices than these. Okay? There's actually a couple of things going on here. This teaches us that although animal sacrifices were sufficient for the earthly tabernacle, that's the first part right there. There's a heavenly tabernacle, there's an earthly tabernacle, but there's a heavenly tabernacle. And that heavenly tabernacle, that's the one where things really happen. That's right? That's the one where it counts up there, big time. The earthly tabernacle was to teach us about what was going on in the heavenly tabernacle. So that's one thing. The other thing is that he's telling us right here, these earthly sacrifices, they're not good enough. Right? Look at what he says. The heavenly things themselves have to have better sacrifices. The earthly sacrifices of just animals, bulls, goats, that's not good enough. Not for eternal salvation. Not for eternal salvation. So he's teaching us here what has to happen for our forgiveness of sins, for us to be forgiven and to be able to live in his presence for eternity. That's a big price. Especially when God himself had to pay it, right? When he had to pay it himself. All right, so how about another one? Another reason why the Levitical sacrifices couldn't bring perfection. It said, I'm just going to read what's in yellow. For the law can never, with these same sacrifices, there we go again. So now he's not talking about the priesthood now, right? He's talking about the sacrifices, right? He says, for the law can never, with those same sacrifices, which they offer continually, over and over, year by year, those sacrifices can't make people who approach perfect. He says, if they could, they would have stopped offering them a long time ago, right? If they could make the person, if they could perfect us, they would not have needed to be offered over and over and over and over and over again. It says, for it is not, and this is just so clear, for it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats can take away sins. There it is again. Remember, I started off with this and I said that the institutions of the Mosaic law are not the basis for forgiveness of sins. And let's leave it for Israel right now. Why? He says right here, it's impossible. Not the blood of bulls and goats. Not the blood of bulls and goats, okay? So here we learn that animal sacrifices do not bring perfection and cannot take away sins. He's telling us that again, okay? All right, here's another reason. Hebrews 10:5-7. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. Okay, so what are we going to learn here? Here we learn that animal sacrifices cannot replace that perfect sacrifice of Yeshua. Right? Here what we learn, this is from Psalm 40. And this is the psalmist speaking, but this is in Psalm 40, this is Yeshua speaking through the psalmist. Okay? Right here, when it says, therefore, when he came into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. That's Yeshua talking. But the psalmist is telling us what Yeshua, he's taught, and oftentimes in many of these messianic prophecies, we are listening to conversations between Adonai and Yeshua. Just like at the beginning of Hebrews, where it says, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. That's the Father talking to the Son. But the psalmist, under the prophetic inspiration of the Spirit, he is telling us what the Father said to the Son. The same thing right here. This is Yeshua speaking. And he said, look, these animal sacrifices and offering, you didn't desire those. That's not what it was all about. Everybody see what I'm saying? He's like, no. He said, a body you prepared a body for me because that's really what you want, because that's really the only thing that's going to work. The only thing that's going to appease my wrath, and the only thing that's going to cover their sins is going to be your body, not these animals. That's not going to work, okay? All right, let's look at another one. Hebrews 9:11. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come with a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Now what's he doing? We've already seen that the Aaronic priesthood wasn't good enough. We just saw that animal sacrifices weren't good enough. And now our homilist is saying, hey, you know what? That tabernacle isn't so hot either. That earthly tabernacle, nope. Not good enough. Not good enough. Not for eternal salvation. Not for God who had to come to this earth and die for the wicked creation when he is totally and utterly holy and separate from everything that goes on down here. For Christ has not entered into holy places. Here it is again, made with hands. Right? There's a real one. There is a real one in heaven. And so here we learn that the earthly tabernacle was not the perfect tabernacle. It had to be the heavenly tabernacle. So our homilist, he is doing an awesome job here because he's just one by one. So in summary, we have seen that the reasons why animal sacrifices and the earthly tabernacle could not bring perfection. So now we've seen the reasons why the Aaronic priesthood, number one, animal sacrifices. That's right, this is animal sacrifices, I'm sorry. These are the reasons why animal sacrifices and the earthly tabernacle could not bring perfection. He just gave us the reasons why. And the reasons why perfection can only be brought by the sacrifice of Yeshua's body and a heavenly tabernacle. All right. The Aaronic priesthood and Levitical animal sacrifices are obviously temporary. Right? Let's see how we know that. In order for perfection to be brought in, the imperfect Aaronic priesthood, the imperfect Levitical sacrifices, and the imperfect earthly tabernacle had to be temporary, serving as a shadow until such a time when they would give way to Adonai's ultimate high priest and his ultimate sacrifice in that ultimate temple in heaven, thus enabling perfection to be attained. Okay? That's how it's going to happen, all right? Therefore, one thing is certainly obvious. The Levitical or the Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical sacrifices were temporary. All right? It should be obvious. Because he's told us Israel's not getting forgiven based on the Aaronic priesthood. I'm not going to forgive Israel based on those animal sacrifices. And I'm not going to forgive Israel based on that earthly tabernacle. So if Israel's going to get forgiveness, we got to have a plan B. And that plan B is the Melchizedek priesthood, the sacrifice of Yeshua's body and in the heavenly tabernacle. And that's the point he's getting at. So our homilist goes out of his way to educate us about the need for a perfect high priest after the order of Melchizedek, a perfect sacrifice as exemplified by Yeshua's body, and a perfect heavenly tabernacle as the means through which perfection could be attained. All right? So now that we've got that under our belt, now we can prove that the second aspect of that which is about to become obsolete, grow old, and vanish away is the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical sacrifices, and the earthly tabernacle, not the entire Mosaic law. Okay? Not the entire Mosaic law. That's not what's... the writer of Hebrews has been very specific in these three areas that were not perfect, that needed perfection. And so, besides, what I want you guys to see here is that besides Hebrews 8:13, and let me read Hebrews 8:13 for you. I'm just going to read it so we have it fresh in our mind. It says here, in that he says, a new covenant he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. And as I said when I taught last time, where it says here, in that he says a new covenant, when he says a new covenant, it says he has made the first obsolete. Well, the first what? And people want to put, the first priesthood and the first tabernacle and all those things. No, it's the first covenant. Because what we've already seen is that the first sphere of obsolescence is the covenant, meaning the agreement, not the Mosaic law. And so what happens is when we read Hebrews, let's look at Hebrews 8:7. It says, but now he has obtained a more excellent ministry in that inasmuch as he is mediator of a better covenant, which is established on better promises. That's where he introduces the covenant right there. In verse 7, for if that first, and then a lot of Messianics have problem with the translator supplied italics there. It says first covenant, that's in italics. And that means that there's no Greek word there. They supplied it to help us understand. And many people have problems that say, well, it's not the covenant, it's it's the priesthood or the sacrifices or the ministry. Well, if you substitute those in there, you totally miss the first sphere of obsolescence, because the first sphere of obsolescence has to do with the covenant being changed. The Mosaic covenant was changed. Not that they didn't have to do it, but that Adonai said, I'm going to make sure it happens. Right? It was based on you guys trying to make it happen. All right? All right. So let's see what we got here. The Aaronic priest, okay, So what's becoming old what's becoming old and obsolete is the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical sacrifices, and the earthly tabernacle. All right, I need to scoot a little bit here. All right, so what I want to say here is that throughout Hebrews 7 through 10, our homilist, he uses language similar to that in Hebrews 8:13, and suggests that certain institutions found in the Mosaic law will soon be no longer needed, will need to be changed, will need to be annulled, taken away, or phased out. In other words, just like in Hebrews 8:13, where he said, something is growing old and obsolete, he uses that same kind of language throughout the book of Hebrews. So let's just look at a few of them. In each instance, when he uses this language about something about to change or go away, in each instance, we see that the institution that needs to be replaced or changed in some way is always pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood, Levitical sacrifices, or the earthly tabernacle. I'm gonna power through some verses here. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should arise according to the order of Melchizedek? So, see, that old priesthood, now we got a new one, right? Right here, 7:12. For the priesthood being changed, of necessity, there is a change in the law. And when he says a change in the law, if you go in context, he's talking about the change of the law of what qualifies you to be a priest, right? It's the change in the law of what qualifies you to be a priest, because in context, he's talking about how a Levitical priest, their lineage had to come through Aaron. And so he's saying that law needs to change, okay? He says, not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life, okay? Now, look at this, Hebrews 7:18. For on the one hand, there is the annulling of the former commandment. What's he talking about? Again, it's the same context. An annulling of the commandment that you had to be a descendant of Aaron. Because the new priesthood has nothing to do with being a descendant of Aaron. That law will be annulled because there's a new law for Melchizedek that he had to have an unending life. Okay? So that verse right there is not talking about the Torah either. You need to, when you look at it in context, he's talking about the law of someone being a descendant of Aaron. But Christ has become high priest of good things to come with a greater and more tabernacle, and better tabernacle, more perfect tabernacle, not made. Again, see, we're going to go from one to the other, right? Hebrews 9:12, not with the blood of bulls and goats, but with his own blood. See, no longer the blood of bulls and goats, now his blood. There's going to be a change. There's going to be a shift. And what was before okay is not going to be okay. All right? Clearly, that which is becoming obsolete, growing old, and ready to vanish are those elements of the Mosaic law pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood, animal sacrifices, and the earthly tabernacle. There's only one way to bring in perfection, and that is through Yeshua's mediation as high priest in the order of Melchizedek, and the blood of his own body and self-sacrifice offered in the heavenly tabernacle, not the earthly tabernacle. Okay. Therefore, all the shadows will pass away at some point. All the shadows will pass away. Let me just get to, all right. So in summary, here's in summary. In summary, the second aspect of what is becoming obsolete, growing old, and is ready to vanish away pertains to certain Mosaic institutions, not the Mosaic law, specifically the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical sacrifices, and the earthly tabernacle. These are temporary and will remain active until Yeshua brings perfection. And that's not until Revelation 21. That's why you still see priests offering sacrifices during the millennium. That's why Ezekiel's temple in Ezekiel 40 through 48, that's why you see him explaining all those sacrifices that they will be offering during the millennium. And the reason why is because the millennium is not perfection. Perfection is not until Revelation 21. So these are temporary and will remain active until Yeshua brings perfection complete perfection through the sacrifice of himself and his high priestly ministry in the order of Melchizedek in the tabernacle made without hands. And so that, just in summary, that summarizes the second sphere of obsolescence. And remember, the first sphere of obsolescence, that which is growing old, is the covenant agreement with Israel. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, but it's not Israel that's responsible for making those three areas of responsibility. Adonai said, I'm going to do it. And as I've said before, what Adonai purposes to do, it will happen. And so that first aspect, because as soon as we say, a certain aspect of the Mosaic law is done away with, it's not the commandments, right? The commandments are still going to be fulfilled. The shift is in who's responsible for making it happen. And Adonai is going to make it happen. All right, I'm getting the signals. Thank you, guys.